This is footage of an old black and white wedding. The bride and groom are getting ready to cut their wedding cake, but then the images start to distort and fade away. We pull back to reveal that they aren't really there anymore. The room is empty, lit by just a few flickering candles. What if I told you you could marry someone who is no longer alive? And what if I told you your country would officially recognize it? Sounds impossible, right? Well, not everywhere. In certain places around the world, so-called ghost marriages are not only possible, they're actually legal, and the reasons behind them are far stranger than you might think. Most famously, this strange custom is rooted in rural China. There, for centuries, families would arrange a marriage between a living person and a deceased one, usually to honor tradition or to complete the life of someone who died unmarried. The idea is similar in some ways to the Victorian era's custom of mourning one's deceased loved ones, sometimes by wearing black clothing or jewelry for years. But the Chinese custom goes further. In fact, China has had laws governing ghost marriages since the early 1950s, but it's never been exactly clear how widespread the practice was until recently. The first documented example of a ghost marriage took place in 1953 when a farmer named Wang Zhengyi petitioned local officials to marry his widowed daughter to a man who had died 25 years earlier. You see, in some Chinese villages, people still follow the tradition of having a main wife and several secondary wives. This was the case with Wang's daughter. And because she didn't have a second husband to marry her off to, she became what's known as a leftover woman, a single woman past the age of 30, which brings shame upon her and her family. So she begged officials to allow her to marry the ghost of a dead man. They agreed, and she married the ghost of a distant relative, even though he was already married to another woman. In another case in 1974, a young woman named Zhang Shuxian wanted to marry her boyfriend, but he died suddenly. Grief-stricken, she asked officials to let her marry his ghost. After weighing the pros and cons, officials finally gave their blessing. Then in 2003, a peasant named Wu Qingxi married the ghost of a man from a neighboring village. She chose him because he was said to be handsome and rich. In fact, he had been wealthy enough to own several houses before he died, and Wu figured that if she married him, she would get all of his property. However, she didn't know that his widow would put up a fight. The two women fought over the dead man for years until they finally reached a compromise. Wu and the widow decided to split the dead man's estate and the inheritance. And those are just a few examples of how far the practice of ghost marriages has spread in China. Even today, it remains common in some parts of the country. Now you may be wondering, what does the law say about ghost marriages in China? Well, in general, the government doesn't recognize these unions, but it turns a blind eye to them. As long as the marriage is performed in private and doesn't disrupt social order, authorities are unlikely to intervene. If a ghost marriage is discovered, however, the couple may face fines or other penalties, and in most cases, the living spouse cannot inherit any property from the dead one. Still, this hasn't stopped thousands of Chinese from taking part in ghost marriages every year. But why? Why would anyone want to marry someone who isn't alive? To understand the appeal, we have to look at the reasons behind the practice. For many, it comes down to tradition. In some parts of China, it's customary to marry off daughters as soon as possible. And if a young man dies before finding a wife, his family may arrange a ghost marriage to ensure that he does not end up bringing shame upon them. Others participate in ghost marriages for economic reasons. In many Chinese villages, the bride's family must pay a hefty dowry to the groom's family. And if the groom is dead, the bride's family can save a lot of money. Finally, some take part in ghost marriages because they believe it will bring them good luck. According to Chinese folklore, if you marry a ghost, you'll never have to worry about money again. And even if you're poor now, you'll become rich after your marriage. Of course, these beliefs are not backed by science, but that doesn't stop people from trying their luck. But China is not the only country where ghost marriages are legal. France, too, allows posthumous marriages. And the law dates back to the 1950s, when the country experienced a devastating dam disaster that killed hundreds of people. The disaster left many widows and orphans, and one woman found herself in a particularly difficult situation. Her name was Antoinette, and she had been engaged to a man named Paul, who died in the disaster. After the tragedy, Antoinette struggled to move on. She couldn't find anyone else to marry, and she was desperate to find a way to honor her fiancé's memory. That's when she turned to the French president and asked him to grant her request to marry her late fiancé. Her story touched the president's heart, and he approved her request, allowing her to become the first woman in France to marry a dead man. Since then, French law has allowed for posthumous marriages in special circumstances, and today, the tradition continues. If a woman wants to marry a dead man, she must obtain approval from the President of the French Republic. Once the president gives his consent, the marriage can be solemnized in a civil ceremony. In most cases, the bride wears white and the ceremony takes place in a church. After the ceremony, the couple is considered man and wife in the eyes of the law, and the bride can even inherit her husband's property if he dies intestate. So while ghost marriages may seem like a far-fetched fantasy, they are real and they are legal in some places. In fact, they've been practiced for centuries in some cultures, and experts say they reveal how deeply our cultural values intertwine marriage and death. Marriage with a dead person is a taboo subject in many countries, but it is a reality for many others. So what do you think? None of the events depicted are fictional. The stories contained within are true and based on extensive research. None of the events depicted are fictional. Would you ever consider marrying someone who is no longer alive? Let us know in the comments. And while you're at it, don't forget to subscribe for more unbelievable true stories from around the world.